Greenhouse people, I'm your host, Bill Calkins, and as always, in an effort to provide this critical information in different ways, we're pleased to offer it as a video and a podcast. My guest, Dr. Josh Henry, is a technical specialist with Ball Seed Technical Services, and he's back to finish, literally, his discussion of Vegetative Coleus as part of our Tech on Demand series covering key annuals and perennials that are commercially produced and loved around the world. He recently joined me to walk greenhouse professionals through propagation best practices when starting coleus, and now he returns to help you finish high-quality coleus crops. If you like this installment, be sure to subscribe to the Tech on Demand podcast on your favorite app and find dozens of Tech on Demand videos on the Ball Seed YouTube channel. Josh, welcome once again to Tech on Demand. I will include a link to your coleus propagation content in the show notes. So why don't you go ahead and jump right into finishing this important crop?
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Bill. So moving into finishing your vegetative coleus, let's start again a little bit on the background of vegetative coleus. Again, we can talk about things in terms of the seed varieties that we have available as well as the vegetative varieties. This presentation is going to focus on those vegetative varieties. Again, some of the benefits that we discussed in the propagation video of some of the benefits of vegetative coleus include later flowering, more sun-tolerant varieties, and also a lot of really unique leaf textures, growth habits, and patterns on those leaves that make them stand out from their seed counterparts. When we're talking about finishing these vegetative coleus, the typical finishing time is going to take about 5 to 10 weeks, but it really does depend on which variety you're growing, as there are some varieties that take a little bit longer and some that finish a little bit quicker. And it also depends on the time of year and where you're actually growing these coleus. Earlier in the season, you can expect them to take a little bit on the longer end of this time frame, and as we progress into the season, they may take a little bit less time. It's also going to depend on container size, which we'll talk about in a minute here. First, let's talk a little bit about some transplanting best management practices. One of the things that you should do if you're bringing these liners in from an external supplier is you should consider trying to transplant these liners as soon as possible. The longer that you're holding these liners, the more time that they have to get root bound, to stretch excessively, and just lose overall quality. So one of the first things that you should try to do is get them transplanted. If you can't, there are some best practices for holding. In general, you should try and hold them at a little bit of a lower temperature to keep them from growing too quickly. But at the same time, you also do need to remember to feed. If you're going to be holding them for several days or a week or so, you may want to consider doing multiple light applications with some kind of low ammonium fertilizer, something like a 13-2-13 or a 15-0-15, just to keep those plants happy and keep them compact. However, if you know you're going to be transplanting them soon, it may be good to come in with one application of something that's a little bit higher in ammonium, a little bit higher in phosphorus, just to give those plants the fertility that they need to root out into their new container. So if you know you're about to transplant, you might want to hit them with something like a 20-10-20 at about 200 parts per million nitrogen. Another thing to consider with coleus, a lot of times these vegetative varieties are going to be pinched at transplant. So if that is what you intend to do, that's something that you should consider doing to help promote branching and get a nice bulky plant at finish. You can also consider using some of our plant growth regulators, things like Ethifon, which would be something like Florel, or Configure, to help increase the amount of lateral branching that you get from these liners. However, we typically recommend that you allow those liners to fully root out to the edge of the pot before making those applications. For containers and substrates that are used for finishing, you're going to want to lean into a standard finishing media, whether you're buying something in or you're producing it in-house, something that is well drained, something typically that has at least about 70% peat, and the rest being more of those bulky materials, things like wood fiber, perlite, whatever substrate components that you typically use. You want to aim for a substrate pH of about 5.6 to 6.0, and you want to have a substrate with a relatively high starter charge because these are very vigorous plants. So somewhere around a 1 to 1.5 millisiemens per centimeter from a 1 to 2 dilution is what you should be aiming for. Some of the common container sizes that we use include things like 4 to 5 inch, which typically would only have about one liner per pot and would take somewhere about 5 to 7 weeks to finish. As we move into the larger container sizes, something like a 6 inch might take 1 to 3 liners per pot, and taking about 6 to 8 weeks. And then as you move into those much larger sizes, something like a 10 to 12 inch combo basket, something like that, you're going to want maybe more like 4 to 5 plants per pot, with a finishing time of about 8 to 11 weeks. Again, one caveat I'll say here is that this can vary a lot depending on the variety that you've chosen, and so hopefully you can go and find the culture sheets for that specific variety, and it can give you some more defined guidelines as to how long it's going to take for a certain container. For fertility and moisture management, we're going to use a lot of those high nitrate fertilizers, things like 13-213 or 15-5-15, at about 150 to 200 parts per million nitrogen, especially when they're in that smaller stage and they haven't really started bulking up yet. But as they do start to bulk up, you may want to move into something like a 200 to 300 part per million nitrogen range, just to give them the fertility that they need to get that vegetative growth on top. And you may also want to start utilizing something like a 20-10-20, something that's a little higher in that ammoniacal nitrogen to help improve lateral branching as you're trying to bulk up these plants. For a pour through EC, you want to look for something around a 2 to 3. And if you're doing a 1 to 2 dilution, it's going to be something more like a 0.6 to a 0.9. For moisture management, pretty standard here. We want to make sure that we're irrigating up to a level 4. Again, a level 4, you can see on the screen here, we have some demonstrations of what each of those levels looks like. A level 4 is well irrigated, but not in a complete swamp. And you want to dry it down to a level 2 where it's fairly dry, but not completely bone dry. When you get down to a level 1, you run the risk of causing leaf scorch. If you get beyond that permanent wilting point, you can cause that permanent damage to the plant that it's not able to grow out of. Moving into light and temperature, as far as light is concerned, most of these vegetative coleus can tolerate fairly high light levels. Generally, the recommendation is going to be somewhere in that 800 to 1200 micromoles per square meter per second. If you're looking at things from a DLI standpoint, most of those shade coleus varieties are going to be somewhere in that 10 to 20 moles per day, generally closer to 10 to 15, with a minimum of about a 4 DLI. And the sun coleus, on the other hand, can tolerate much higher levels, with optimal levels being at least 18 moles or higher, but with a minimum of 8. And one thing to consider as well is that when you have those higher light levels, that's going to accelerate flowering. But with again, with most of these vegetative coleus varieties, they tend not to flower very easily very early on due to that very long juvenility that's been bred into them. And one other consideration when it comes to light is that those higher light levels will intensify the coloration. You can see that in this graphic right here from a study that was done in 2010 that showed with increasing DLI, you get a stronger intensification of those different pigments, the anthocyanin type pigments that we value in these coleus varieties. For temperature, we typically are looking at something like a 70 to 75 degree Fahrenheit range, so fairly moderate to warm. Night temperatures of about 62 to 65 degrees. It's important to consider coleus are considered somewhat of a tropical plant in some ways, and when you get those really low temperatures, that can cause very hard and compact growth with very poor branching. And if you get temperatures too low, you can also have damage to the plant. So we definitely want to make sure that we keep them warm enough. As far as plant growth regulators are concerned, you can see a great figure here from Brian Whipker. This was in the 2019-2020 Grower Talks annual PGR guide, showing the effects of different rates of paclobutrazol on one side and then ethifon on the other, and how those different rates help to keep those plants nice and compact. We have a lot of options in terms of what we can apply. Diminazide is a great option at about 2,500 to 5,000 parts per million. Chloride, something like Ultracell, at about 800 to 1,500 parts per million. And paclobutrazol as a spray at about 5 to 30 parts per million is a great option. And again, as we mentioned earlier, you can look at things like ethifon and configure to help increase that lateral branching. For pests and diseases, there's a couple of pests that can be an issue. Typically, aphids and whitefly are going to be some of the more common issues. Mealybugs, thrips, and then our standard things like fungus gnats and shoreflies can also be an issue, but nothing really out of the ordinary. As far as diseases are concerned, there are some leaf spots like alternaria, different leaf blights. Botrytis can be a big issue, especially when you have high humidity and a really very dense canopy of vegetation. Viruses, there's a couple that can be an issue. INSV and TSWV can be issues. We have our standard stem and root rots, which tend to be more issues when you have highly saturated media. And then the big issue that I want to mention is our downy mildew. So downy mildew can be a big issue in coleus. We saw this year in 2024, we saw a lot of growers having to deal with it quite a bit, especially in our kind of lime green varieties. It stands out like you can see in the pictures here. And it's really important that you manage your environmental parameters and you have a good preventative fungicide program to help control downy mildew. There's a couple of great chemistries that you can use. Some of the good ones that have had quite a bit of success are listed here. Remember that it's important to rotate your different modes of action, so utilize chemistries with different group numbers to make sure that you don't develop resistance in your downy mildews. And then some of the cultural controls, things like irrigating early in the day, making sure you have good air movement, reducing that humidity, removing plants that are severely symptomatic. All of those things are important. Providing adequate spacing between the plants. These are all things that you need to do to make sure that you can keep downy mildew to a minimum. And you may possibly see plants recover, but a lot of times when you see very pronounced symptoms, it's best to just rogue those plants out and make sure that they don't infect other coleus that are growing in the same area. So this is one of the really key diseases that you should keep an eye on with these vegetative coleus. And with that, that covers most of the main topics in terms of finishing vegetative coleus. And I hope that you have a good time trying to grow your vegetative coleus crop.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Josh. And I'm actually really glad you spent a few extra minutes on Coleus downy mildew because we definitely saw issues with that recently, and I'm sure they will pop up again sooner than later. And thank you for sharing this slide here. You can find dozens, if not hundreds, of Tech on Demand educational resources online. Every week I send a newsletter covering a range of cultural and technical topics. We've created tons of videos for growers of all skill levels, and the Tech on Demand podcast is a great way to learn about technical topics on the go. And if you want to join more than 6,000 of your professional greenhouse peers, I suggest you join the Greenhouse Tech Team group on Facebook. All you got to do is search Greenhouse Tech Team, answer a couple simple questions, and I will let you right in. Josh, as always, thank you so much for your time. And I know we'll talk again soon because we got more crops to cover, right?
Right. Thanks, Bill.
Awesome. I'm Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand. And on behalf of our entire team, thanks for listening and watching, and take care out there.